There is something uniquely painful about being rejected by the very people who made you fall in love with something. For Eddie Van Halen, the guitar was never just an instrument. It was a language he learned in secret, practiced until his fingers bled, and eventually spoke better than almost anyone alive. He grew up worshiping certain players the way other kids worshipped athletes or movie stars. He copied their licks, studied their tone, and dreamed of one day standing in the same room with them. But fame has a cruel way of complicating admiration. As Eddie's star rose through the late 1970s and into the 80s, he began crossing paths with the legends he had idolized, and what he found behind the curtain was not always what he had imagined. Some ignored him, some dismissed him, some stole from him, and at least one made him question everything he had built. By the time Eddie Van Halen reached his 60s, he had lived long enough to process those wounds with honesty, to speak about them not with bitterness, but with the kind of clear-eyed perspective that only decades of reflection can produce. These are the 6 guitarists Eddie Van Halen had real complicated feelings about, the ones who disappointed him, rivaled him, dismissed him, or simply broke his heart without ever knowing it. Before any of the fame, before the screaming arenas and the magazine covers and the world tours, there was a teenage boy in Pasadena, California, sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor with a battered guitar and a stack of Cream records. That boy was Eddie Van Halen, and the sound coming through those records belonged to Eric Clapton. More specifically, it belonged to a track called Crossroads, recorded live at the Fillmore in 1968, a performance so raw and so alive that it felt less like music and more like electricity running through wire. Eddie did not just listen to Clapton, he obsessed over him. He would slow down the record and try to decode every bend, every vibrato, every pause. He told Guitar World in a 1995 interview, "Clapton was my main influence. I used to sit there for hours trying to figure out what he was doing." That kind of devotion shapes a musician at a cellular level. Clapton was not just a favorite player to Eddie, he was the reason Eddie became a player at all. Which is exactly why What Happened in 1980 hit so hard. By that point, Eddie had released Eruption, a 1-minute and 42-second instrumental that genuinely rewrote what the electric guitar was capable of. Critics were calling him the future of rock. Magazines could not print his name fast enough, and then someone asked Eric Clapton about this new sensation from California, and Clapton's response was measured, polite, and devastating. He said Eddie was technically very good, but that he did not hear much soul in the playing. For most people, that would be a minor slight from a colleague. For Eddie, it was like being disowned. He admitted years later that it broke his heart. Here was the man who had unknowingly taught him everything, now standing at a microphone and dismissing the music Eddie had poured himself into. The philosophical gap between them was enormous. Clapton came from the British blues tradition, a world where restraint was sacred and every note had to earn its place. Eddie came from somewhere else entirely, a world of harmonic invention, whammy bar dives, and two-handed tapping that nobody had ever heard before. To Clapton's ears, trained on Muddy Waters and Robert Johnson, what Eddie was doing may have genuinely sounded more like athletics than art. Eddie never fired back publicly. That was not his nature, but the wound stayed with him. He told Guitar World, "It kind of broke my heart. I learned everything from him. I wasn't trying to outplay him." What makes this story linger is not the conflict but the love underneath it. Even after the dismissal, Eddie continued to speak about Clapton's playing on Crossroads with reverence. He called that tone untouchable. He meant it. The admiration never died. It just learned to coexist with disappointment. The two men reportedly met in person in Los Angeles sometime in the mid-'80s. Eddie went into that meeting the way anyone meets their childhood hero, nervous and hopeful. Clapton was cordial. They talked about gear. They did not talk about music in any deeper way. Afterward, Eddie reportedly said the quiet part out loud to a friend he had loved the myth more than the man. It was a deeply honest thing to say, and it marked a turning point in how Eddie saw the people he had put on pedestals. By the time Eddie was in his 60s, and reflecting back on a lifetime in music, the Clapton chapter had resolved into something that felt less like a wound and more like a lesson. He understood, finally, that two players can both be brilliant and still be completely wrong for each other's ears. If Clapton was the emotional foundation of Eddie's guitar education, then Ritchie Blackmore was the technical one. Deep Purple's lead guitarist brought something to rock that was unlike anything the genre had seen before he arrived. A combination of classical European phrasing, aggressive tone shaping, and a dramatic sense of dynamics that made every solo feel like it was building towards something inevitable. Eddie studied Blackmore with the same intensity he brought to Clapton. Highway Star, Burn Smoke on the Water, these were not just songs to Eddie but curriculum. So when Van Halen broke through in 1978, and Eddie suddenly found himself sharing industry spaces with the musicians he had grown up worshipping, he was genuinely excited. He was not trying to prove anything in those moments. He was a fan who also happened to be on the same stage, which made his first encounter with Blackmore all the more jarring. Eddie recalled it in a 1982 Guitar Player interview with writer Jas Obrecht. He said Blackmore simply stared at him. No greeting, no acknowledgement, nothing. Just a flat, cold gaze and then silence. For Eddie, who was by all accounts one of the most genuinely warm and open personalities in rock music, someone who would talk about pickup wiring with anyone who showed interest, that wall of indifference was almost incomprehensible. He said it crushed him. Later, he would tell Rock and Roll Garage, "People like Joe Perry and Ritchie Blackmore just gave me the shaft with their eyes. Wouldn't say hello, wouldn't be nice. No, nothing. I'm not that way." That phrase, the shaft with their eyes, is both vivid and specific. It captures something more cutting than open hostility. Hostility at least acknowledges your existence. What Blackmore offered was something colder, issuer. Part of what made this confusing was the generational and stylistic gap between them. Blackmore was a disciplined architect of guitar solos, someone who structured his playing with almost mathematical care. Eddie was something altogether different, intuitive, explosive, guided by feel rather than formula. When Blackmore was later asked about Van Halen's playing, he offered what sounded like a compliment, but functioned as a critique. He said Eddie played too many notes. That line sparked debates for years. Yet time has a way of dissolving these walls. By 2008, Blackmore told Classic Rock magazine that he could not deny what Eddie had brought to the instrument. He acknowledged the tapping, the whammy bar innovations, and said Eddie had found his own voice. That recognition came decades after Eddie had stopped needing it, but it came. And for a man who had once stood before Blackmore as a hopeful fan and received nothing but silence, it was something. The Aerosmith guitarist represented something specific to Eddie Van Halen, a certain kind of American rock swagger that had defined the first half of the 1970s. Joe Perry was all instinct and attitude, a player who made the guitar sound like it was barely being controlled, like something dangerous just barely leashed. Eddie respected that enormously. He had grown up on Aerosmith records the same way he had grown up on Deep Purple. Which is why the early touring years stung the way they did. In that same 1982 Guitar Player interview, Eddie described how players like Joe Perry would pass him without acknowledgement, would not offer so much as a nod after Eddie had finished a set that left crowds stunned. He said Perry and others seemed deliberately cold, and he offered his honest read on why they felt threatened. He said, and this is a direct recollection from that interview, that they would not go out of their way to help anybody because they would feel threatened. That is a bold thing to say, and Eddie knew it. But he was not wrong. The late 70s were a genuine inflection point in rock guitar, a moment when the techniques and sounds Eddie was introducing were making everything that came before them feel slightly older than it had the week before. For a player like Perry, who had spent years building his reputation on a very particular sound and style, the arrival of someone like Eddie must have been disorienting at minimum and threatening at worst. Eddie never confronted Perry directly. He was not built for that kind of confrontation. Instead, he absorbed the slight and channeled it into his playing, which, if anything, only became more extraordinary under pressure. He once said that he did not care if he was playing a Holiday Inn lounge, he enjoyed playing. That was the truest thing about him. The politics of the industry could wound him, but they could not redirect him. Years later, Joe Perry came around entirely. In a 2013 interview covered by Van Halen News Desk, Perry said that Eddie had taken everything he heard and put his own stamp on it, that hearing the debut Van Halen album had floored him completely, that he kept going back to figure out the sounds and the energy. He called it reinvention of guitar playing. By the time Perry said those words, Eddie had long stopped keeping score. But the reversal was telling. The Cold Shoulder of 1978 had given way to genuine admiration, and that trajectory said everything about the arc of Eddie's impact. This one is different from the others because it was not about dismissal or generational rivalry. It was about something Eddie found almost harder to process: imitation. Tom Scholz, the MIT-educated founder of Boston, was one of the most technically gifted musicians in American rock. He had designed his own recording equipment, built his own amplification systems, and created a studio sound on Boston's debut album that was so clean and precise, it almost did not sound human. He was brilliant in a way that operated on entirely different frequencies from Eddie's brilliance. The friction began at a shared festival appearance sometime in the late 1970s. Van Halen had just finished their set, Eddie had played his solo, the crowd was still electric from it, and then Scholz, performing with Boston shortly afterward, incorporated elements of what Eddie had just played into his own performance. Eddie was standing at the side of the stage watching this happen. He described the experience in a Guitar Player interview from 1980, saying the crowd was looking at him like they were confused, and that he was, in his own words, pissed. What compounded the frustration was Scholz's personality. Eddie described him as someone who never came around backstage, never said hello, just appeared on stage, performed, and vanished. The combination of that aloofness with what felt like on-stage mimicry was genuinely maddening to a player who had invented his techniques from scratch, who had literally built his guitar by hand. Eddie's Frankenstrat was not purchased from a music store. It was assembled and modified and obsessed over until it produced sounds nobody else could replicate. Watching someone mirror those sounds without even acknowledging him felt like a specific kind of violation. Eddie spoke about originality in terms that went beyond competitiveness. He genuinely believed that the point of learning from someone else was to eventually find your own voice, not to recreate theirs. He said there was a difference between inspiration and duplication, and that if you never evolved beyond what someone else was doing, you were just tracing someone else's shadow. Tom Scholz, to his credit, eventually acknowledged Eddie's imagination in a rare interview, saying it was not something you could teach, and Eddie, years later, acknowledged that building your own gear, which Scholz absolutely did, was something he deeply respected. Two geniuses who process the world in opposite ways, one through feel and spontaneity, one through engineering and precision, never quite found common ground, but eventually found something resembling mutual respect from a safe distance. Of all the conflicts on this list, the Rick Derringer situation is the one that most clearly illustrates the line Eddie Van Halen drew between inspiration and theft. Derringer was a legitimate rock veteran, a player with real credibility, and a catalog that Eddie had grown up respecting. When Derringer was tapped to open for Van Halen in 1978, it should have been a moment Eddie appreciated, a chance to share a bill with someone from the generation of players he admired. What happened instead became one of the defining confrontations of Eddie's early career. Derringer, performing his opening set, began incorporating Eddie's tapping technique, and more specifically, elements of Eddie's actual melodic solos into his performance. When Eddie confronted him afterward at the bar that night, his words were direct and revealed the full complexity of his feelings. He told Derringer that he had grown up on his music, that he respected him, and that he did not care if Derringer used the technique, but that playing his actual melody was a line he could not accept. The next night, Derringer did it again. He even closed his set with "You Really Got Me," a song Van Halen had essentially made their own as a live staple. Eddie's response was immediate and unambiguous. He told Derringer that if it continued, he would not be on the tour anymore, and that was the end of it. Derringer was removed. What makes this story linger in Eddie's own telling is the layer of self-awareness he brought to it. He admitted, years later, that the situation was complicated by the fact that he himself had absorbed things from Derringer's playing back when he was a kid learning his craft. He understood imitation as part of how musicians develop. What he could not accept was a peer, a professional, lifting his actual solos note for note on a shared stage. That was not development, that was something else. David Lee Roth reportedly made a joke about the whole thing backstage, saying Van Halen did not do cover bands, especially not of themselves, but for Eddie, the laughter came later. In the moment, it was a lesson about the cost of originality. The better you became, the more people would try to wear your sound like a coat. Protecting it was not arrogance, it was self-preservation. The most complicated entry on this list is also the most human. Randy Rhoads was a classical guitar student from North Hollywood who became Ozzy Osbourne's